All right, Shabbos, say good morning, a good tavach. Everybody had a beautiful, uplifting, and meaningful Shabbos. Sorry if there was ambiguity on the Daf Yomi message about who was giving the shir this morning. The general call is, unless I say it's someone else explicitly with a name, an address, a social security number, it's going to be me. It's going to be me, Miz. I'm sorry. For better or for worse. For better or for worse. All right, our shir today is dedicated by our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Jerry and Sarah Wolaski, in the Schusar Refuah Shlema for their grandson Zechariah Dov ben Perel Shira. We hope that he will have a complete and enduring refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Nancy and David Berkowitz, in celebration of their son Jonathan's recent engagement to Rachel Harris. Mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. New couple should be zocheh to go to the chuppah b'sha'a tova u'metzlachas. But with that, let us begin. We have a great daf ahead of us today. So actually, Baruch Hashem, we made good ground. We covered good ground yesterday's daf. Today's daf is daf Zayin 7, and we are picking up Emirat Hashem on the last line of Vav Amud Beis. Amar Rava. Rava says as follows. So some more interesting cases regarding Kiddushin. Amar Rava, Tein Mana Leploni ve'akadesh lecha. This is an interesting case. Rachel says to Ruvain, you go ahead and give a manah. Manah is an amount of money, right? You give a manah to Shimon. Okay, following this, Rachel says, right, Tein mana leploni v'akadesh lecha. Right? So Rashi says, v'akadesh lecha, u'kishenas levo amar le'yiskachi li mikudeshes v'af agav d'lomati ana liyada. So Rachel says to Reuven, give a manah to Shimon, and I'll become mikudeshes to you. So Rashi fills in the blanks over here. And Rashi says what ends up happening is Reuven gives it to Shimon, and after he gives it to Shimon, he says to her, Hare'at mikudeshes li, right? B'mana shenasati l'Shimon. What's the halacha? Mikudeshes. It works. Now, why does it work? Midin arev. It works, I will say, from the same basic mechanics of a guarantor. Now, look at Rashi. Midin arev. Mimash shematzinu b'Torah sha'arev mishtabid l'malva ani yicholin l'mod. I will say, what is an arev? An arev is a guarantor. So, for example, Reuven lends Shimon money. Am I not speaking? I'll speak closer. Sorry. Reuven, it's me. I'm sorry. Reuven lends Shimon money. And remember again, and Levi decides to go ahead and be a guarantor for the debt. Now I will say, guarantor becomes a guarantor even though what? Nothing is being given to him. Right? In other words, you could have a situation where a guarantor gets something, but really a person is created as a guarantor even though he has received nothing to be meshabed himself. So what do you see from the din of an arev? What you see from the din of an arev is you could create a shibud. You could create, I'll use those shibud is probably not the right word, but you could go ahead and be meshabed yourself. You could commit yourself to something even though you have not received any item, even though you have not received any benefit. So we did Arev lav afagav lo mati anal yadei. I'm going to read faster. Yaakov ben Zakin made me self-conscious that I give the shir to. He's not used to listening to me at less than 1.5 speed. So I'm gonna. Yeah, and I get that a lot. Okay, so I'm gonna make a conscious effort today. Thank you, Yaakov. So it's not elul unless you're mavayish someone barabim. You know, come on. So the Gemara says as follows. So we did arev. So arev lav afagav d'lamati anal yadei kameshabed nafshe. Both saying arev, a guarantor commits himself to something even though he has received nothing tangible in return. So Arev creates a paradigm for us that you could go ahead and commit yourself to something, right, based on a transaction, even though you are not the beneficiary of the transaction. So based on that, if Rachel says to Reuven, I'm willing to be married to you if you give a manah to Shimon. If you give money to Shimon, so that actually works to create Kiddushin, even though Rachel is not actually receiving anything, it works because it's based on the framework of Arev. Incredible. So the Gemara says, so this woman also, even though she hasn't received anything, right? There's no benefit, no tangible benefit coming her way, since ultimately, again, it works als arev, she's meshabed herself, and ultimately enters into marriage. Next case. Heiluch money v'izkachi leploni. So let's take a look at Rashi over here. Heiluch money v'izkachi leploni v'hu shlucho ela shemekacha mishalo. So this is an interesting case. Reuven comes over to Rachel, and Reuven says to Rachel, take this money and become married to Shimon. Become married to Shimon. So we'll say at first glance doesn't seem to be a very big deal because Lamaisa, Reuben is acting as Shimon's shliach. And we're going to see you could actually affect marriage through a shaliach. What's the wrinkle over here? The wrinkle over here, interestingly enough, is Reuben, the shaliach, ends up using his own money. That's what Rashi points out over here. So Reuven is the shliach of Shimon, Ella shemekadsha mishalo. But whereas in a typical case of shlichus, the shliach would be using the money of the Baal, of the soon-to-be husband, here the shliach is using his own money. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Mikudeshes, ultimately again it works. Now why does it work? Midin Eved Kinani, very interesting. It works based on the same mechanics of Eved Kinani. What does this mean? Eved Kinani lav avagav delo kachaser velo midi kakani nafshe. There was in Eved Kinani, technically speaking, can go ahead, bless you, could go ahead and be emancipated, even though, again, he doesn't pay his way out, right? There are different ways that Eved Kanani gains his emancipation. He can become fully emancipated, thereby acquire himself without going ahead and losing any money. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Midin Eved Kanani, Distam Maslisan Lekaman, Kones Atzma Bekesef, Ayedeh Acherim, Shacherim Poldin Osa Bemabon, Vukona Atzma V'yotze Lecheros. So both sides, this is very interesting. So in Eved Kanani, again, let's assume right now the typical way that an Eved Kanani is emancipated is he buys his freedom. He buys his freedom. So we're going to learn later on that there's a concept that essentially, you could emancipate or you could pay the emancipation amount for an Eved Kanani. So now you can have a situation where an Eved Kanani acquires himself even though he has not been made deficient, i.e., he has not spent any of his own money. So there's a paradigm that exists where a person could acquire something, in this case themselves, without going ahead and using any of their own funds. Similarly, the Gemara says, "Hai gavernami afagav delo chaser velo midi kakanila hai isisa." So too again in this case, I will say the husband Shimon could acquire a wife, so to speak, even though what? He's not spending his own money. Ultimately, again, it is the shaliach, it is Reuven who's spending the money. Now, I will say, the truth is, this case is a bit more complicated because Lamaisa, again, how exactly the mechanics of this work? Does Reuven, the shaliach, have to be making the money? Okay, we're going to leave that on the side. The point I will say is, the Gemara is highlighting two different frameworks for Kiddushin. So the first framework is, again, first case is, Rachel says to Reuven, give a money to Shimon, and I'll become Mikudeshes to you. The Gemara says it works. What's the novelty? Rachel's not getting anything. Why does it work? Based on the concept of a guarantor, of an Arif. Case 2, right? Shimon is sending a Shaliach Reuven to be Mekadesh a woman. Shimon says to Rachel, accept this money and become Mikudeshes to Shimon. Only one issue, which is, Reuven is using his own money. It works, else Eved Kanani. What does Eved Kanani teach us? That you could acquire something even without spending your own money, right? Because Eved Kanani can be emancipated even if he doesn't spend his own money. Good, two different paradigms. The Gemara says as follows. Next. Teiman leploni va'kadesh ani lo. So we'll say another interesting case, right? So now, let's say in this case, Rachel is saying, give a money to Ploni, right? So Rachel says to Reuven, give a money to Ploni, and I will become Mikudeshes to him. All right, so in this case, it's actually very interesting. And this actually shouldn't work based on what we've learned before, namely that halacha lamaisa, so Kiddushin cannot be a woman-driven process. But watch how this does work. So one more time. Rachel is saying to Reuven, take this manna and give it to Shimon, and I will become Mikudeshes to him. Okay, look at Rashi. Va'akadesh ani lo. Rashi says, v'hu kiblo v'amar lo his kadshili bekach. So the Gemara says as follows. So Mikudeshes midin shnehem. Ultimately, this case works, but why does it work? It works both because it's a combination of Eved Kanani or Arev and Eved Kanani. Watch this. Arev, lav afagav lo kamat hana liyadei kameshabei nafshei. So an Arev, we'll say, what does Arev tell you? Arev tells you that you can become committed to something even if you get no benefit from it. Right, that's what Arev teaches you. Therefore, in this same way, Hai isasanami afagav delo kamati anar liyadei kamekai nafsha. So it's about saying, in this case, is Rachel getting any benefit? Is she getting any benefit? No. Why? But she's the one furnishing the kesef kiddushin. She's the one furnishing the kesef kiddushin. So we'll say, so fascinating. Arev teaches me that I can become committed to something even though I get no benefit from it. We're going to come back to that concept in just a moment, right? Furthermore, again, the Gemara says, 1 second, mi dami arev, haidika kanile kachasr mamona. But I don't understand about say, how could this be compared to a case of an arev? After all, again, in a typical case of the arev, the one who is acquiring, the kakanile, which is the lova, ultimately does lose money. Hai gavra kakanile lahai isisa velo kachasr velo midi. But at the end of the day, this guy's acquiring a woman, and he, so to speak, and he's not down any money. He's not deficient in any way. The Gemara says, Eved kinani yochiach, Eved Kinani can prove this point, because there is a case of where an Eved could acquire himself without losing any money, and he acquires something, in this case himself. How can you compare the case? Hasam hach deka makni kakani. We'll say there, ultimately again, it's the person who is makna, meaning the adon, who ultimately again conveys ownership of the eved to himself, who acquires the money. Hacha hay isisa kamakanya nafsha velo kakanya velo midi. Right, but in this case, Rabbi will say it's not comparable. Ariv yochiach. So let's look at the case of guarantor. Afagav lo kamati anal yadei mishabei nafshe. Even though halacha lemaisa, even though the Arev doesn't get any benefit, the Arev still commits themselves. So Rabbi will say, so again, therefore that last case is not really as conclusive. I will say, but I will, so again, the point to keep in mind are these two constructs. The Arev construct, which teaches us that halacha l'maaseh you can become meshubad to something, committed to something, even if you've received no benefit. And the Eved Kanani concept, which teaches us that you could acquire something even if you have not spent any of your own money. Based on those two paradigms, if Rachel tells Shimon, give a mana to Ruvain and I'll become mikudeshes to him, that works, that's Arev. And similarly, again, if Rachel goes ahead and, what was the second case? Right, Helich mana leploni v'skachi. Right, go ahead and give this mana to Ploni, and I'll become mikudeshes. That ultimately works out Eved Kinani. Incredible. So by Rava, we'll say two more cases. By Rava, Helich mana v'akadishani lecha mahu. So what about the following case? Take this mana, and I'll become mikudeshes to you. What's the halacha? So Amar Zutra mishmei d'Rab Papa mikudeshes. It works. Amar Ravashi lemar Zutra imkain haveli nechasim sheish l'achrayis niknim im nechasim she'ein l'achrayis. So I'll say this is actually very interesting. So in a case where Rachel says, ultimately again, right, give a mana. So one more time, Heilech mana va'akadishani lecha. So Rachel says to Ruvain, take this mana. She's giving him the money. Take this mana, and I'll become mikudeshes to you. So in this case, you've just cut out the intermediary. Rachel speaking directly to Ruvain, take this mana, become mikudeshes to you. And I will say, I will point out to you, Rashi says, obviously, that won't work to affect Kiddushin, right? Why won't it work to affect Kiddushin? Because that's a female-driven process. So obviously, the way the case has to work is, she gives him the money, and then he says, Hari at mikudeshes li b'kesav zu. Right? So he transforms it. Again, the Gemara is leaving that piece out because the Gemara assumes that, of course, we know that, because if a woman just gives money to a man, that doesn't affect Kiddushin. So just the case is, she's giving him the money, right? Heilech mana, take this mana. I'm sorry. Right, so take this money, I'll become mikudeshes to you. He receives it, and then Rashi points out, he says to her, his kachili bekach, become mikudeshes to me with this money. But the money's coming from her to him. Good. So the Gemara says, this is very interesting. The Gemara says mikudeshes, it works. Now the Gemara will say something very interesting. So if you notice, there are two things happening over here, right? The husband is acquiring two things. What are the two things he's acquiring? Right, number one, money. Number two, a wife. Now, here's what's interesting. How is he acquiring the wife, right? We're saying a win-win. It's a good deal, right? So how is he? So here's what's interesting. The money seems to be what's affecting both of these transactions. Receiving the money, you get the money, and through reception of the money, ultimately, again, it's affecting Kiddushin as well. So the Gemara points out something very interesting over here. He says, how does this really work? This should be a case of nechasim, sheyesh lahem achrayis, niknin in nechasim she'ein lahem achrayis. So I'll say, this is very interesting. We know that in the world of property, there's two different types of property. There's nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayis, which usually refers to real property. Land, real estate, avadim, versus nechasim she'ein lan achrayus, which usually refers to movable property. Let's say, by the way, the literal translation, nechasim she'yesh lan achrayus, means land or property for which there is responsibility. Because generally when you purchase real estate, you purchase it with achrayus, which means if I buy property from Ruvain and then the property is seized from Ruvain's creditors, by Ruvain's creditors, I'm going to go back to Ruvain to make me whole. That's called Ruvain has achrayus. So again, so I'll say, so in this case over here, this is actually quite interesting. In this case over here, the assumption is the money is nechasim she'ein lan achrayus, right? It's movable property. A wife is like nechasim she'esh lan achrayus, is like real property. So the Gemara says it's interesting that what's happening over here, through the mechanism of money, which is nechasim she'ein lahen achrayus, you are acquiring what? Nechasim sheyesh lam achrayus. And about saying halacha, that doesn't normally work. In halacha, the reverse is true. Look at Rashi. So look at the Gemara. The Gemara says, "Va'anon ibchan tanan nechasim she'ein lan achrayus niktim im nechasim sheyesh lam achrayus bekesef b'shtar u'bechazaka." And I will say, now let me just explain this to you outside. This is actually a very pasha case. I will say, if I'm buying land from Ruvain, so let's say I want to do this. I want to get into farming. Right? Yeah. No, right, the rabbinets run its course, right? So again, so I want to run its course. So what happens? I decide I'm going to buy a farm. And I want to buy farming equipment. So there's a tractor. I can't name anything more than a tractor. Right? I'm probably not cut out for this line of work. But anyway, there's a big tractor, a little tractor, right? A medium-sized tractor. There's a whole bunch of tractors, right? So I say, so what do I do? I go over to Ruvain, and I say, Ruvain, I want to buy the land. So I said there's a concept that when you buy real property, you could also acquire movable property along with it. So what I could do is with one kinyan on the karka, nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayus, I could also acquire the nechasim she'ein lan achrayus. By acquiring movable property, real property, I could also acquire real property. Now, the case I was giving you happens to be even an easier case because the movable property is situated on top of the real property. Even if it's not like that, it still works. A kinyan on real property could allow you to acquire movable property as well, but the reverse does not work. The reverse does not work. So in other words, if I were to acquire the tractors, so let's say I acquire the tractor, kesef, right? I give him money, right? Or chazaka, I go ahead and or mashicha. So I go ahead and I acquire the tractor. Acquiring the tractor does not allow me to acquire the land. So the Gemara says, this case doesn't make any sense. Rachel goes over to Ruvain. She says, Ruvain, behir heilech manazeh, take this mana and I'll become mikudeshes to you. So the Gemara says mikudeshes. So we'll say this sounds like he's acquiring the money, and by acquiring the money, he's also acquiring a wife. But money is nechasim she'ein lan achrayus, like movable property, and a wife, right? A wife would be more considered to be real property. So how does that work? That movable property, so to speak, could acquire real property. Amrale, listen to this. This is incredible. Mi savris the Amrale agav. Mi savris the Amrale agav. Hacha ba'adam chashav askinan. Tebahi hana dekamakabel matanamine gamra umakagile nafshe. So Rabbi said, this is incredible. This is a different kind of case. Let's say this is a case where Ruvain is a very chashav a person. Now I will say, often at least it was the way in the Gemara, chashav people wouldn't accept matanos. They wouldn't accept gifts, right? Why? I would say because it was like a shtickle beneath them, right? If you're a chashiv person, you have everything. I don't need a matana from anyone. So therefore, again, an adam chashuv was only accepted matanas from very specific and a select group of people. So the case over here is Rachel is giving Ruvain a mana, and Ruvain ultimately is a adam chashuv. So she says, Heilech manazu. The Kiddushin is not affected through the money. It's not affected through the money. What is it affected through? The hana that she gets by knowing that an Adam Chashuv accepts her gift. Because I'll say again, that type of hana, that hana is a quantifiable hana. You know, if I become the kind of person that Reuven accepts gifts from, you know, suddenly again I have a whole entry into a whole bunch of new circles, right? New deals open up, new opportunities open up. That is a quantifiable and tangible hana. That's the hana that she's receiving, that she commits herself to when getting married. Incredible. And that's what affects the Kiddushin. Rava says, by the way, all of these halachas that we've learned before also apply ultimately again to regular financial transactions. As Rabbi say, the mechanics that we spoke about before, when it comes to Arev, when it comes to Eved Kinani, will work by regular dinei mamras, will work by financial transactions as well. To which the Gemara says it's shricha. So why do you have to say that it works both by financial transactions as well as by Kiddushin? Tiashon in Kiddushin, if you would have just said Kiddushin, Mishum Dahai Isisa Necha Le Becholduhu Kidresh Lakish. So say, I might have thought that, we'll say, let's take a step back. See, here's one more time. What's the takeaway over here? So what we've been introduced to, I will say, is that up until now, I mean, we haven't been learning Kiddushin for all that long, but in the last couple of days, if someone were to ask you, what is like the most immutable, unchangeable law of Kiddushin? You would have said, in order for Kiddushin to be effective, what has to happen? The woman has to receive something from the man. Kasev, shtar, biyah, has to receive something tangible. What we're introduced to in today's daf is that is not necessarily true, or that tangibility could look different ways. Namely, that you could affect Kiddushin using the mechanism of Arev. So what's the mechanism of Arev? Ultimately, again, right, Rachel says to Ruvain, give a money to Shimon, and I'll become Mikudeshes to Shimon. I'll become Mikudeshes to you. I should become Mikudeshes to you based on that money that you give. How does that work? That's Arev. Right? Arev tells us that you could become committed to something, even if what? You have received nothing tangible in return. Case number two. What was case number two? Sorry, right? Case number two ultimately was go ahead and this was the case of where, remember, Shimon, or I keep mixing up the names, Ruvain is acting as a shaliach for Shimon to Mekadesh Rachel, right? But Ruvain ends up using his own money instead of Shimon's money. That works. Why does that work? Eved Kinani. Eved Kinani could acquire himself even though what? He has not received anything of benefit. So Rabbi says, so now what the Gemara is saying over here is that halacha l'maisa, these concepts work for Kiddushin and work for other financial transactions as well. So the Gemara says, okay, why do you need to say that? The Gemara says, because had you not said it, I would have thought it just works for Kiddushin. Why does it work for Kiddushin? We'll say, because in general for Kiddushin, a woman doesn't need all that much to commit to marriage. Now, what does that mean? Right? So the Gemara says, listen to this. Kidrei Shlakish, Tav lemesav tandu me lemesav armala. Ultimately, again, from a woman's perspective, it is better to be married with someone than to be alone. Rashi says over here, right? He says, "Tandu begufim shnayim bal ve'ishto v'afilo eino la ela letzeves ba'alma." So we'll say, so again, some level of companionship is better than being alone. Now, say it's actually interesting because if you notice, we have like competing motifs in Chazal. Because last week we learned that it's the man who runs after the woman in order to affect Kiddushin, which sounds like man needs marriage much more than woman. And again, in Ksuvis, we saw ways in which Chazal to incentivize women getting married. But yet, interestingly enough, here you have Reish Lakish saying that a woman would prefer even marrying someone who she's not that crazy about, but just in order to have companionship, then ultimately, again, to be alone. You know, it reminds me of the famous Mamar Chazal, right? If you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with, right? So I'll say, so Lamaisa, again, which I will say is an incredible yesod. So the Gemara says, so therefore I would have thought maybe Arev, Eved, Kinani, maybe that works for Kiddushin, because Lamaisa, again, in Kiddushin anyway, a woman is pretty much ready to commit as long as the guy is normal, as long as the guy is somewhat stable. You know, so maybe she'd be willing to commit even for lesser amounts. And that's when you could use the mechanisms of Eved or of Arev. Avamamona, maybe not by financial transactions. Maybe financial transactions really require the real conveyance of Hana. If we would have just said because we'll say in general, money can be forgiven, right? Financial transaction, money can be forgiven. Aval Kiddushin emolo, but by Kiddushin not. Therefore, we'll say you need both cases. Therefore, we'll say we emerge with this with really four concepts. Number one, the concept of Aref, that Allah Lamaisa, you could commit yourself to something even though you've received no benefit. Number two, that you could acquire something even if you have not given away any funds. right? Number 3, that these concepts apply both to Kiddushin as well as to Mammon. And number 4, which is also interesting about say, is that a woman can become Mikudeshes if she receives non-tangible hana. Right? What was the case of non-tangible hana? Where she's giving money to Ruvain. Ruvain is an Adam Chashuv. What's the non-tangible hana? That an Adam Chashuv is accepting my gift. Right? That's enough. That's change of status is enough for her to commit herself as well. Incredible. Well, I'll just mention this idea. I'll just mention that it's fascinating that the way the Gemara describes an Arev, a guarantor, is an Arev is someone, afagav dolomati hana liadei kameshabed nafshe. Even though a person receives no benefit, they commit themselves. So I was thinking about this concept a little bit last night, and this idea, we have a concept of Arev also, or a concept of Arvos. Kol Yisrael Arevin, either Zeh Bazeh or Zeh Lozeh, different girsaos. A concept of mutual responsibility. The din of Arvus says that as a klal, as a people, we are responsible for one another. And I will say this this line was incredible. What does it mean to be an Arev? To be responsible for each other means, even if you don't get any benefit through your Arvus for another Jew, you're still meshabed yourself. Right? Sometimes we'll say, in relationships, we're often very utilitarian. And before we invest in a relationship, we're getting about what's in it for me? What's in it for me? But there are certain types of relationships in life that have to be selfless relationships. That it's not about what's in it for me, but it's about the fact that I'm committed to this, even if I can't recognize any tangible benefit. What does it mean to be part of Klal Yisrael? What does it mean, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh? What does that mean? It means I am an Arev for you, and you are an Arev for me. And what does it mean to be mutually responsible for one another? Afagav delabati hana liadei. Even if you get no benefit from that arvus, or no perceived benefit from being responsible for your fellow Jew, I'm still committed. I'm still going to say that's what it means to be an Arev. That's what it means to be responsible for. Even if you can't recognize any tangible benefit, we are still all responsible. We're still all meshabed towards one another. Incredible. Let's go back there. Says the Gemara, Amarava. We'll say first white line. Great cases here. His kachi l'chatzeai. So we'll say, listen to this. A man says to a woman, become mikudeshes to half of me. Right? So this is Ruvain saying to Rachel. Right? Become mikudeshes to half of me. Okay, mikudeshes, it works. It works. Chatziech mikudeshes li. If Ruvain says to Rachel, I'm being mekadesh half of you, ain't mikudeshes. It doesn't work. I don't understand. Maishna chatziecha mikudeshes li, deina mikudeshes. So we'll say, so Abai says, Rabbi, I don't understand. Why is it that if he says, half of me, right, if Ruvain says, half of me is mikudeshes to you, or half of me is marrying you, it works. But if he marries half of her, it doesn't work. It's very simple. Isha amrach manav lo chatzi isha, because the Torah says a man can marry a woman, not half a woman, right? Either in or you're out. Either in or you're out. You can't marry half a woman, either a whole woman or none, right? So we'll say on the other hand, okay, it's the same thing. You can't marry half a man either. So what's the pshat? Listen to this. Hachi hashta hasam isisa lebeitrei lo chazia. So let's remember again, a woman can't marry two men. Ela gavra milo chazi lebeitrei. Technically speaking, on a biblical level, a man can marry two women. Vachi kamerla. This is what he means to say to her. Di iba ina laminsav achrisi nasibna. So we'll say it's fascinating. So ultimately, again, when Reuven says to Rachel, become mikudeshes to half of me. That's another way of saying what? Another way of saying what? I may marry additional women. Rachel should run, right? Right? I may marry additional women, right? That's what he's saying. As opposed to when he says to her, I'm being makadesh half of you, there's no such construct like that. Rachel cannot marry two men. She can't marry two men. So lemaisa again, lemaisa, it does not work. It's a fascinating distinction. Amali marzotra berei d'Rab Mari l'Ravina v'nefsha tulei kiddushin bekula. So we'll say it's fascinating. I don't understand. Now Gemara says, even when he says to her, Chatziech mikudeshes li, even if Reuven says to Rachel, listen Rachel, half of you should become mikudeshes to me, it should work. We'll say, watch this, it's fascinating. Bless you. Why should it work? Because once he's mekadesh part of her, essentially we'll say, what should occur? The Kiddushin should spread to the rest of her. Now, what's the mechanics? This is incredible. Do we not learn? Haomer ragla shalzu ola. We'll say, if a person goes over to an animal and he says, the leg of this animal is an ola. I will say, now, technically speaking, an ola is an animal, right? A whole animal. But in this case, all he's doing is he's being makadesh a leg. The leg of this animal should be an ola. What's the halacha? Kula ola. The entire animal becomes an ola. Va'afilu l'man da'amra in kula ola. I will say, because the kedusha spreads. Once you mekadesh a leg, it spreads to the rest of the animal. Now, interestingly enough, even according to the opinion that says no, if you're mekadesh a leg, it doesn't spread to the rest of the animal. That's only if you consecrated a part of the animal that the animal could live without. But I will say, if you're makdish a part of the animal that the animal cannot live without, then what? Then Lamaisa, everyone agrees that the entire animal is hektish. So for example, if you go over to an animal and you say, Rosh, right, Rosh, the head of this animal should be an ola. Everyone agrees. Say, what happens? What happens? The Kiddushin spreads the entire animal. So the Gemara is asking over here, when a man is mekadesh half a woman, right? Reuben goes over to Rachel and says, half of you should become mikudeshes to me. I will say, half of a person is what we would call an Ever Shanashama Tuluyabo, right? Life is dependent on having at least half of your body. So Lamaisa again, Lamaisa, why not go ahead and say, once he's Mekadesh half of her, then what? Then what? The Kiddushin spreads to the rest of her. To which the Gemara says, Mi Dami, how can you compare the cases? Hacha Hasam Behema, Hacha Das Acheres. I'll say, it's not exactly a good comparison. Why isn't it a good comparison? Because Lamaisa, one is talking about an animal, and one is talking about a person with das. To which the Gemara says, Halo dami ellaha. This could be compared to the following case. Dam Rabbi Yochanan, behema shal shnei shutfin. If you have an animal that belongs to two partners, Reuven and Shimon own an animal in partnership. Now what happened? Hektish chatzia. So I'll say, so imagine for a moment, Reuven was makdish his half. The chazar v'lakcha v'gdisha. So we'll say, then what happens? Then Reuven buys out Shimon, and then Reuven is makdish what was Shimon's half. So we'll say, what's the status of the animal? What's the status? Kiddusha ve'ena kreva. So the halach is, we'll say, ultimately, again, it has hekdish, but it only has financial sanctity. It does not have physical sanctity, therefore it can never be offered up as a carbon. But we'll say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Halo damya, from the bottom, maskanat terutzahu, ein davar zed doma el lebehemo shel shnei shutvin, di'ika das acheres hama'akeves ba, v'hasam lo amina detiktash kula v'apia echad. Ve'ena krev Rashi says, Holo b'tchilas ekdisha, lo niras the karev shelo kidsha ele chatzia. So we'll say, the point over here is, what do you see from this case? Here you have two people owning an animal jointly, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven is makdish his part. Shimon was not makdish his part. So you have an animal that's partially consecrated. The fact that later on Reuven goes ahead and buys out Shimon and now is makdish the other part, that's fine. So now it's fully kodesh, but it never attains the level of physical sanctity. And most what it becomes is financial sanctity, right? Kiddusha's damim. And therefore, as a result, ultimately it's kadosh, but it can't be offered up. It could be, you could create a tmura. Remember, if you exchange it for another animal, it creates a tmura. Utmura sakiyotseba. And ultimately, again, its tmura has the same status, ultimately, again, of the animal itself. Now, I will say, now pause here for just a moment. For our purposes, again, what does this show you? So this shows you, I will say, that when there is, there's two cases. The case of a person who is makdish, let's say the head of an animal. Let's go with the head because everyone agrees in that case. So everyone agrees, if you're makdish the head of a sheep, right, for an ola, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? The entire animal is consecrated, right? So therefore, yet contrast that with the case of an animal owned by Reuven and Shimon, and Reuven is makdish his half, and Shimon is not makdish his half. Even if Reuven subsequently buys out Shimon and consecrates the other half, it never attains financial sanctity. What do you see from here? That when there is intellect, when there's das involved, so Kiddusha doesn't automatically spread. So too, just to kind of circle back, when Reuven says to Rachel, half of you should become mikudeshes to me, so as much as we wanted to say that Kiddushin should just spread, that doesn't happen in a situation where there's das. Spreading of Kiddusha only happens when ultimately, again, there's no das. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if Reuven says to Rachel, half of you is mikudeshes to me, what's the halacha? Eina mikudeshes. It doesn't work. I'll just point out something very interesting over here, that there's two incredible concepts that come out of this. The number one, I will say, you see that in the world of Kiddusha, just going back to the animal for just a moment, that there's an opinion that says that if you're makdish, the leg of an animal, that Kiddusha automatically spreads to the rest of the animal. Rabbi tells you something amazing. That in the world of Kiddusha, all you need to do sometimes in life to get on the right path towards the actualization of Kiddusha is something. You don't have to do something dramatic. You don't have to do something heroic. You don't have to do something amazing. Sometimes all you need to do is just a little act of Kiddusha, like get your pinky toe Kaddish. Just endow your life, imbue yourself with some level of Kiddusha. And the way Kiddusha works is that Kiddusha goes ahead and spreads. Rabbi will say, you know what sometimes prevents Kiddusha from spreading? This is incredible. You know what prevents Kiddusha from spreading? Das. Sometimes we overthink things. So they say, come on, I'm so broken, I'm so this, I'm so impaired, I'm so handicapped, it's never going to work. How could one little act of Kiddusha go ahead and really spread throughout my entirety? Sometimes it's das, which impairs and impedes the spreading of Kiddusha. Sometimes they'll say in Ruchnius, what a person has to do is dispense with the das and just do. Just plot yourself on a trajectory of growth. Just start doing good things, and also parallel-wise, stop doing bad things, right? Just get your leg kaddish. Just endow and imbue yourself with a little bit of Kiddusha. Don't overthink it. Just do it. Put the das to the side, endow yourself with a bit of Kiddusha, and something amazing happens, which is the Kiddusha spreads. And before you know it, you're kula kaddish. Incredible. Shema minat klas, says the Gemara. We learned three things from here. Amud Beis. Number one, Shema Mina, Balei Chaim Nitchim. Rabbi said, this is actually very interesting. Balei Chaim Nitchim, Rabbi means that sometimes what we learn is that sometimes Nitchim means set aside. Set aside. When something is initially set aside, it remains set aside. So for example, in this case over here, in the case of the animal owned by two partners, once the animal could not attain full physical sanctity, because it was only partially sanctified, it remains nidcha. It remains unable to go ahead and achieve a level of physical sanctity. Ushmamina, dichui meikara, havadichui. So we learn that when something is initially set aside, it retains that status even if circumstances change. And lastly, Ushmamina yesh dichui b'damim. I will say finally what we learn is that halacha l'maisa, the concept of dichui, something set aside, being unable to go ahead and reach a certain status, applies even to items that only have financial sanctity. So three incredible lessons. Incredible. Fine, let's go back there. By Rava. So we'll say, here we go. Some more interesting cases. Zayin Rabbeis 7b, 2 lines down. By Rava, or now 3 lines down. Chatziech b'chatzi pruta. V'chatziech b'chatzi pruta. Mao. So Rava says, it's an interesting case. Reuven says to Rachel, I want to acquire half of you with half a pruta, and the other half of you with another half a pruta. Okay, I don't know. I was thinking about this. Like, where did this come up? Right? I will say sometimes, a man wants to impress a woman that he's learning, that he's a ben Torah, he's been going to shir every day, right? So he throws one of these gemaras out at her. Again, don't do it. Just say, "Will you marry me?" Anyway, the gemara says as follows. So, but in this case over here, he says, "So I want to betroth half of you with half a pruta, and half of you with half a pruta." So does it work? Mao, kevan damarla chatzi pruta paska. So here's what's interesting. Do we look at both of these statements kind of individually? Now, if we look at them individually, then what has he done? What is he trying to do? He's trying to affect some level of Kiddushin with half a pruta. Rabbi will say, can you affect Kiddushin with half a pruta? No, that's the first Mishnah. Of course not. So therefore, we'll say, if we look at these statements individually, then of course, halacha l'maisa, they're meaningless. They're meaningless because you cannot go ahead and be mekadesh a woman with half a pruta. O dilma mona v'holech. Or maybe we look at it and say, no, we don't look at this. We don't look at the statements individually. Rather, we look at them what in continuity, right? That what is he doing? It's a whole speech. Half of you for half a pruta, the other half of you for the other half a pruta. So the mice again, holech l'mona mosa means we look at the two parts of the speech as one cohesive verbal unit, and therefore it should work. Now, I'll say if you say mona v'holech, so therefore we look at both of those statements as one cohesive verbal unit. Listen to this. Chatziech b'pruta, v'chatziech b'pruta mahu. Well, say what if he says to her, I want to be mekadesh half of you with a pruta and half of you with a pruta? Does that work? Mahu. Kevan da'amrla b'pruta u'pruta paska l'milsei. So I'll say, so do we say that Lamaisa again, since he said a pruta, then obviously again these statements are to be reckoned individually. And therefore I will say, now it still won't work. Why won't it work? Because even though he's using the right unit of currency, he's saying what? half of you, and that doesn't work. Odoma, kol biomei monav holichu. And I will say, maybe we say in general, anything he says over the course of a day is monav holich. We'll say ultimately again, it's all part of the same verbal unit. So we'll say it's the same fundamental question. When a person is making two statements, so do we look? And obviously, both statements are directed at Kiddushin. Do we look at the statements individually, or do we look at them collectively? That's the fundamental question. So if you want to say that ultimately anything said over a course of a day is considered to be like one cohesive verbal unit, okay. So what happens if he says to her, I want to be mekadesh half of you with a pruta today, and half of you with a pruta tomorrow. So then we say, look, once you're getting into multiple days, then no, we can't look at that as one cohesive verbal unit. Therefore, it's two different statements. And I will say, in this case over here, as much as you've got the unit of currency right, you can't be mekadesh half a woman. And therefore, it's not going to work. Oh, Dama, this is what it means to say to her, Kiddushin maschelu be'a'idna, Maybe what it means to her saying like this: I'm starting a process, and the process begins today, and it will conclude tomorrow. And therefore, perhaps, even though it's spanning 2 days, it should be one cohesive rebel unit. Okay, next question. What happens if he says to her, I want to be mekadesh both of your halves with one pruta? Okay, interesting case, right? Two halves with one pruta. Now, what's the nice part of this? What's the nice part? The nice part is, excuse me. The nice part is, ultimately, again, it is, right? There is one statement, right? So that's good. So I'll say, let's talk about what we have going for us. It's always good to start with what you have going for you, right? So what do we have going for us? Number one statement at one time. Number two, what else do you have going for you? Correct unit of currency. What's working against us? Halves. Shnei chatziech. So now, here he's making both statements at once. Al dilma, ein isha miskadeshes lechatzon klal. Well, see, on the other hand, he's talking about being mekadesh halves, and you can't be mekadesh half a woman at all, and therefore it should not work. To which the Gemara answers, teiku. So we'll say, by the way, that teiku is on everything, right? That teiku is on everything. Now, whenever you have a teiku in any of these cases of Kiddushin, the result ultimately again is going to be safek mekudeshes, which is incredibly problematic. Okay, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Why Rava? Listen to this. Shtei b'no sachal l'shtei banai bepruta mahu. This is a fascinating case. Most imagine the following situation. Reuven has two sons. His sons have appointed him to be the shaliach to accept Kiddushin on their behalf. Shimon has two daughters. And let's go with the idea, just think we can even keep it easy. Like Rashi points this out, Shimon's daughters are minors. And therefore, again, Shimon has the biblical right to marry off his minor daughters. So what happens? So Reuven comes over to Shimon and he says, listen, here's the deal. Let your two daughters become mekudeshes to my two sons, and here's a pruta. One pruta. So mahu. Does it work? Do we say basar nosim the kabbalah azlinan va'ikam amona? O dilma basar dida azlinan v'haleka. So I will say this is fascinating. Do we look at the transaction of Kiddushin through the lens of the people affecting the transaction? Or is it through the parties who are getting married? So we'll say, so what's the nafkamina? If it's about the parties affecting the transaction, there's one father of the grooms, one father of the brides. In which case, one can make the argument that what? Maybe one pruta should work. On the other hand, if it's about the couples, there are two couples. And if there are two couples, each couple is going to require its own pruta. Fascinating. To which the Gemara says, teiku. We'll say, I want to tell you like this. The Gemaras like this are another reason to daven extra hard for Mashiach. I will say, right, it's so frustrating to not know what to do in these cases, and how beautiful it's going to be when Eliyahu Navi comes, and of course you can imagine everyone's going to rush towards him. We'll get him as a skull in residence, Emir Hashem, you know, and again we'll carve out a couple, right? The weekend of the Eliyahu Navi, right? There's going to be no problem getting sponsorships for that, by the way. I have no, right? And let's say, can you imagine again? All we're going to do is just page after page go through all the tekus, and Eliyahu Navi is going to give us clarity on all of this. It's going to be incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Says another teku. By Rav Papa. Bitcho parascha pruta. Okay, this is an interesting one. Right? So Reuven goes over to Shimon, and Reuven says to Shimon, here's the deal. I'd like to marry your daughter and get your cow. Get your cow. And here's a pruta. Here's a pruta for both. Mahu. So we'll say, what is Reuven saying? Is Reuven saying, here's a half a pruta for your daughter, half a pruta for your cow? Or maybe no. In other words, what he's saying is, here's the pruta to affect Kiddushin with your daughter. And no, the cow will do through Mashiach. In other words, the cow has nothing to do with the pruta. Tushni Gemara says teku. I would say, so it's also an incredible yisod, which is, what do you see? What do you see from all these cases? So what you begin to see, what you begin to see is, when you speak in ambiguous ways, no one knows what you're saying. And I would say, specifically in the world of relationships, it is so important to be able to say what you mean, right? How much relationship friction is created because, right, sometimes a spouse feels like, you should know what I need or know what I want, even if I don't say it. Right? People feel like, what's the sign of a good marriage? That you can intuitively know what your wife needs or what your husband needs, even if they never say it. I don't know, like, unless you have like an Urim V'Tumim, right, walking around with you, right? You cannot know what anyone wants or needs unless they tell you. I would say, here's the incredible part. In most good, healthy, loving marriages, if one spouse tells the other what they need, the other spouse is going to come through. But if you expect your spouse to be a Navi, then the Maisa 9 out of 10 times, they're going to fail you. Because no one could really ever know what's in your heart. No one could really ever know what it is. But if you say it, so we'll say that's the most haskell in these statements. When you're ambiguous, and it's not clear what you're saying, no one knows what you're talking about. The halacha doesn't know what you're talking about. And if Chazal can't figure out what you mean or leaves off with a teku, then of course, again, we're not going to know what each other means or our spouses mean if we're not explicit with what it is that we need in the context of a relationship. Such an important yisod. Anyway, let's go weiter. So by Rav Ashi, right? Bitcha v'karka'acha v'pruta mao. Same idea. Reuven goes over to Shimon. Shimon, here's a pruta for your daughter and land. What is going on over here? Is he giving a half a pruta for the girl, half for the daughter, half a pruta for the land? Or maybe the pruta is for the daughter and the karka is going to be acquired through chazaka. So teku. Again, I will say all these cases teku. Ho gavra, another case. Ho gavra, the akdish b'shir. So I will say this is a really interesting case. Actually, we're going to delve into this sugi a lot because it's quite fascinating. I will say, so ho gavra, the akdish b'shirai. A man goes ahead and is mekadesh a woman with shirayim. Now, say shirai are silk. It's silk. He gives her silk. So what's the halacha? Rabba Amar Lo Tzrichi Shuma. Rabba says the truth is you don't need a valuation. Is that the right word? Appraisal. Right? You don't need to have the silk appraised. And Rabba say now what's going on over here? Look at Rashi. Lo Tzrichi Shuma Shumu Osan Shuma Osan Kodem Shetekablim. So I'll say ultimately again we don't need it appraised. Now, Pepashas, why don't you need it appraised? Because it's clear that what? It's worth more than a pruta. Okay, Rav Yosef Amar Tzrichi Shuma. Rav Yosef says no, it needs an appraisal. So the Gemara says, Ida Amar La B'Kol. So what's the case? Ida Amar La B'Kol Kuli Amar La Tzrichi Shuma. So I don't understand. If Reuven says to Rachel, become mikudeshes to me with any amount, i.e. just a pruta, so then everyone should agree that it doesn't require an appraisal, because obviously what? Obviously the silk is worth more than a pruta. If he said become mikudeshes to me, with 50 silver pieces, whatever, right? 50. Below shavu chamshin, now if the silk is not worth 50, halo shavu, then it's not worth anything, and obviously the Kiddushin doesn't work. So kipli, you're about to say, what's the case? Damar chamshin b'shavu chamshin. So this is very interesting. The case over here is where Reuven gives Rachel a piece of silk, and he says, become mikudeshes to me with the value of 50 silver pieces. Right? He gives her the silk. Now it happens to be the silk was worth 50 silver pieces, but there was never an official appraisal beforehand. So watch this. Rabba Amar Lo Tzrichi Shuma. Rabba says it doesn't need an appraisal. Why not? Da Shavu Chamshin. We're good to go. He said 50 and it's worth 50. Rav Yosef Amar Tzrichi Shuma. Rav Yosef said no, it requires a Shuma. Why? Kevan de Isisa Lav Bikia B'Shuma. Since ultimately, again, a woman is not necessarily well versed in appraisals, Lo Samcha Daita. She may think or say that what? Maybe the silk is not worth 50 and therefore doesn't really commit herself to the marriage. So I will say, so a very interesting idea over here, and this gets into, so again, it said this. So according to his first version of the Machlokes, Reuven is saying to Rachel, "Become mikudeshes to me with the value of 50 silver pieces." And what does he do? He doesn't give her silver; he gives her silk. And it happens to be the silk was worth 50 silver pieces, but there was never an official appraisal. So now Rabbah says, "We're good." He said 50. It's worth 50. Rav Yosef says, "We're not good. We're not good." I'll tell you why. Because I will say, she may not know how much the silk is worth. And she may assume that what? That the silk is actually worth less than 50 silver pieces. And therefore, as a result, she doesn't commit herself to Kiddushin. Therefore, essentially what Rav Yosef is going to say is that if you're going to use a physical object to go ahead and actually affect Kiddushin, there must be a formal appraisal before that is used. An alternate version of this, B'chol du nami pligi. Actually, we'll stop over. We'll pick up with this tomorrow, Miras Hashem. We'll say what I will mention is something very interesting. You know this. I saw this by my daughters-in-law. This is not our family minhag. That in the two mishpachos that my boys married into, the minhag there was that the kala wears a very thick veil that you can't see out of. In our family, that's not the minhag. So it was interesting. Where does that minhag come from? To wear a very thick veil that you can't see out of. It actually comes from this Gemara. We don't want the kala to see the ring, right? Why? Don't understand why. Because it's part of it. Because the concern is that halacha lemaisa, if she thinks it's valued as something, but it's really valued at something else, it could be a problem with the Kiddushin. So again, so obviously she sees it when it goes on her finger, but lamaisa, again, there's other origins for the minhag. It's a minhag, other origins as well, but comes from this a concern. That's why I will say, even under the chuppah, we ask the chassan, right, is the ring worth at least a pruta? Right? We don't ask him, by the way, how much did you pay for the ring? But like Jews, right? How much you get that for? Right? How much you get that for? Right? We don't do that. Dafka, we don't want to know how much he got it for. We don't want to know that. All we want to know, all we want the kala to know, is that it was worth at least a pruta. That's the only piece of information that's important for us, because that way we know she's entering into this relationship based on the valuation of a pruta and no more. Because once you get into items that have a greater value, you have an issue of if she thinks it's one thing, it's always something different, you have a fundamental problem with the Kiddushin. So again, we're kind of stopping off in the middle of this sugya, and we should be continuing to Rabbi say, such a schos to begin the week with all of you. Shkoyach. All right, Chabron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Have a great day, Jack. Great to see you.